Yes, that's great.
Great, wonderful. Okay, welcome everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Maria Zollo and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the Australasian Research Management Society, for ARMS. You are tuning into ARMS PD at Zoom session on Smart Work at Home, presented by Professor Sharon Parker, so we welcome Sharon. Before we commence, I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land which we're all sitting while we're listening to this webinar, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also extend this respect to all First Nationals people. Most of us have now transitioned to working from home, and I'm sure that it hasn't necessarily been a seamless transition, to say the least. Today's presentation will focus on how to ensure that working from home is healthy and productive. I will first introduce the SMART model of work design. Using this model, she'll then describe how individuals can best cope with working from home and how managers and supervisors can design and support more effective work. She's been conducting some preliminary findings from research conducted during the COVID-19 pandemic. Professor Parker and her team of researchers at Curtin University Centre for Transformative Work Design are currently conducting a survey on Thrive at Work at Home study to investigate the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on work and wellbeing. Now, the survey link will appear in our next newsletter that is up in ARMS, but I'm sure Professor Parker will allude to that in her presentation today. So I'd like to introduce you to Professor Sharon Parker. Sharon is an ARC Laureate Fellow and a John Curtin Distinguished Professor at Curtin University. She's the Director of the Centre for Transformative Work Design at Curtin University, a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, a Fellow of the Society of Industrial and Organisational Psychology. We welcome Sharon, but before Sharon commences her presentation, I ask that you type your questions in the Q&A functionality on Zoom. We are likely to structure the presentation initially for a good 20 minutes with some questions, and then the presentation will continue. We'll see how that works. But without further ado, I hand over this session to Sharon. So welcome, Sharon.
Thank you very much, Maria, and welcome everybody. Maria, can you just hear me just so I don't spend the next? Yes, great, thank you.
All good.
So thank you. This is a completely surreal experience. I've done many keynote talks, but never ever one like this. So cross fingers that it all works. So welcome everyone. And I look forward to talking with you a little bit about some of our broader research that we've been doing on smart work, but also its application to working from home. So first, just a little bit about us. We are from the Centre for Transformative Work Design, and this is a research centre that we set up, funded by the Laureate funding that I received a few years ago. And our vision in the centre is really to transform work through good work design, to make better lives for workers, better organisations, and actually a sort of better and more flourishing society. So we do both research and practice and consulting and applying our research. And we are part of the Future of Work Institute at Curtin University. So I want to start by talking about what is work design, and this is a fairly academic definition. And work design is about the content and the organisation of the tasks and the activities and the relationships and the responsibilities that we have within our job or role, or within a set of jobs or roles. So we can also think about work design from a group perspective. But I want to make this definition come alive a little bit throughout this seminar. But why does this topic even matter? Well, the first is that work design influences people's physical and mental health, and that is sort of important for pretty obvious reasons. Actually, we're just about to launch a study, for example, on FIFO workers, some of whom are now going away from work for 14 weeks at a time, away from their families, sorry, for 14 weeks at a time. And you can imagine the sort of toll that type of roster has on people's mental health. It also costs a lot of money. So from a mental health perspective, poor work design costs about $10.9 billion per year. But it also has costs in terms of other things, not just mental health, but in terms of lost efficiency and productivity. So lots of reasons for caring about this topic of work design. And it's important to point out that we don't really necessarily have great work design already. And this is some findings from the European Working Conditions Survey. And I mention it because it involves 44,000 workers. And what you can see from that slide there is around about 20% of people have poor quality jobs, so very boring or tedious or unmotivating jobs. And then almost 30% have poorly balanced jobs. So in fact, jobs where there is intolerable demands, as I'll talk about shortly. So if you put those two figures together, we're really talking about 50% of the workforce having work design issues. So it's a topic worthy of investigation. And I like this little tweet that somebody found, I'll just share with you. So, and in fact, now I've discovered that the camera is on top of it, so I just have to move it. So employee says, I want growth in my role. And the company says, oh, okay, great, here's a ping pong table. Autonomy, says the person. Company, oh, here's a fully stocked snack room. Fulfillment, asks the person. Well, here's a DJ in the office. And the person quits, and then the company, well, some people just aren't a good culture fit. And that's sort of a joke. But, you know, I see that time and time again when we talk to managers about work design, where people often make assumptions about people not fitting, or people being lazy, or people being, you know, in other words, basically blaming the person, when actually, in fact, the underlying issue is that the work is not well designed. So when we talk about this concept of work design, actually we measure many, many things. So you can see some of the things that are incorporated into this topic at the top there. So task variety, having control of your work methods, using your skills, having clarity in what you do, having a sense of significance, and so on. And one of the things that we've done recently in our work is to try to make sense of this more than 30 different, what we call work characteristics that explain people's work design, and try to synthesize them. And we've done that and come up with a model called the SMART model of work design. So first, we have a bunch of work characteristics that together define work as being stimulating. So for example, having some variety in your tasks, feeling that you're using your skills, feeling that your work has a point, having some challenge or some complexity in your work, and having some sort of information processing demands. So that's S, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. We also identify some characteristics of work that relate to mastery. So for example, people need feedback in order to be able to improve and master their tasks. They also need to know what it is they're doing, so they need to have some clarity, and that's the role clarity. And also if people are doing a whole job, not just a tiny little fragment, that enables people to understand how their job fits into the bigger picture, which again supports them mastering their work. The A in the SMART stands for agency. Actually, I used to always refer to this as autonomy, but since the focus on autonomous trucks and autonomous vehicles, and people often now having a different meaning of autonomy, I now use the word agency. And this is fundamentally about control and agency, and we'll come back to that again as well. The R stands for relational aspects of work, so connecting and having contact, and of course a very salient issue right now with people working from home. And T refers to tolerable demands, and there are just some of the demands that people experience in their work, such as workload or emotional pressure or long working hours or monitoring of performance, again an issue that's popping up with working from home, and conflicting role expectations and so on. So this is the SMART work design model, and what I plan to do today is go through each of these aspects and discuss how they might be affected by working from home, and some of the actions that we can take ourselves as individuals, but also some of the actions that leaders can take to make the work smarter. So I want to go first of all to stimulating work design, and I'm going to attempt here to cross over to a video. And if it doesn't work, I will come back. So I just want to show you some of the videos that we've been making that explain each of these concepts. I'm just going to show you probably one for the sake of time, but they are all on our website and you can link to them at any time that you like. So I want to just share with you, first of all, the video for stimulating work design. So I hope you enjoyed that little video. So we have one of those for each of the aspects in the model. And so as you can see there, stimulating work is about having work with a bit of variety and interest. And what you can see here in this picture actually is some hospital supply workers. So we did a project a couple of years ago where we had an artist in residence come and sketch people in all sorts of work. And we interviewed them about their work design at that time. And you can see here, the hospital supply workers are talking about, you know, there's never a dull moment, I like the variety, this job teaches me a lot, and so on. So you can see that they're experiencing that stimulating work. And, you know, there are, of course, other sorts of work which are less stimulating. What are some of the problems if people are doing work that's not interesting and that hasn't got variety and so on? And if you look there at the risks of unstimulating work, one of them is obviously disengagement and boredom and those sorts of negative states that people experience. And of course, with those sort of states, if people are disengaged and bored and frustrated with their work, we will see things like turnover, absenteeism, and so on and so forth. We can also have physical risks, though, of this sort of work, because if you're doing the same thing over and over again, you are more likely to get musculoskeletal injuries. And of course, boredom results in things sometimes like accidents and so on. So what we see is a sort of many risks of this sort of work. I think one of the most important ones, in my view, is the wasted talent, because if people are not using their skills and developing their skills and doing varied tasks, they're basically wasting any talent that they might have. So, so stimulating work is important. And what's happening then now that people are working from home? One of the things that's happening is that people are experiencing quantitative underload, and that means just not having enough to do. Actually, I'll show you some stats from our survey in just a minute. So just not having enough to do, and that's partly because for some people they can't do their job properly from home, so they haven't got as much to do as normal. And other people are just experiencing repetition and not using their skills and so on. And that might be a normal feature of their job. It might be partly a function, again, of just only being able to work from home, which narrows the opportunities. So I just want to share, I'll share with you throughout the presentation a few results from our Thrive at Work Home survey, and thank you if you've participated. I'll come back to that a little bit later. But we've had more than 12 or 1,300 people participate in the survey, which has been fantastic. And you can see there that for the item, this job, this week, my job involved performing a variety of tasks. You can see there that about 60% of people are agreeing that that's true, but another 40% are not experiencing much variety in their work. So we know that this is a challenge for people working from home. Not everybody, but for some people. Actually, about 15% of people strongly believe that they have very little to do. And then there's a further 19% that are unsure. So again, around about this 40% of people just feeling that their skills are not being used and they haven't maybe got enough to do. So what do we do about that? And look, honestly, for some things we may not be able to do anything because of the nature of the work and the fact that it has to be done at home right now. But in some cases it might be possible to do things. So I've written a blog on this topic, and because we won't have time to go into detail on everything, I'll refer you to those at the end of the session. They're all again available. But how can we as individuals, if our job is lacking stimulation, is there anything we can do? And in that blog, I talk about people engaging in what's called job crafting. And that's really taking some steps to try and actively create more stimulating work for yourself. So just to give an example, I put a picture of a makeup artist there. I many years ago was doing a talk just like this, but it was in a more public forum, and I was getting my makeup done by a makeup artist. And we were talking about this notion of crafting, which is when you sort of self-initiate changes to your work to make it fit you better. And we were talking about it, and she described how she had actually started doing volunteer work for transvestites and doing their makeup, because she was getting a bit bored with her job. And then she found that by taking on that volunteer activity, actually it led to all sorts of new networks for her, more creativity in her work. And that was a really nice example of what we call crafting. Just to give another example, learning new skills. I mean, just before the pandemic hit, we were obsessively talking about how with the digital economy, everyone is going to need these more digital skills. So what new skills might you need in the future, and can you start learning those now? So again, to give an example, Sana, my assistant, loves artwork, and that's always been one of her passions. And because things are a little bit slower for her right now, because, for example, we're not traveling, so there's no travel to organise. We're not having events, so there's no events to organise. So she, for example, is going to, has been helping with some of our web design work, because actually her passion around colour and art really lends itself well to good web design. So what sort of skills could you learn? And then finally, sometimes it's more cognitive crafting. So it's more reframing how you even think about your work. So in fact, the original research that was conducted on crafting focused on hospital cleaners. And the researchers really identified two different sorts of cleaners. And one group of cleaners define themselves as cleaners, and that's what they did. But another group of cleaners really define themselves as healers. And so they felt very strongly that they made an important contribution, not just to cleaning, but to the hospital itself. So for example, they would show visitors sometimes into the wards to meet their families because the nurses were too busy. Or in the evening, when everyone was gone and quiet, they would sometimes talk to patients in the hospital and so on. And so they crafted their way that they thought about their job, which then in turn led to them to craft their work to make it more interesting and meaningful through the actual tasks that they engaged in. So individuals can do things sometimes. I recognise it might be constrained, but there are opportunities potentially for individuals to exploit. And leaders, of course, can encourage this type of crafting, especially now. and maybe even redistribute tasks to different team members, sort of taking into account whether people are feeling some boredom or frustration or whatever. One of the things we've done as an example is some of the work that we would normally outsource, for example, transcribing or that type of activity. We have made the decision to keep them in-house and to allocate those tasks to our administrative team, again, because people are a bit underloaded, and this is a way to expand their skills and also get a bit of variety into the work. And if you can see some other sorts of actions there. So I want to cover mastery next, and then I'll see whether there are any questions before I carry on with the A, R and the T. So remember mastery, and I won't show the video on this occasion because of time, but they're all there. But mastery is about making sure you're clear what it is that you need to do, because you can't be good at what you're doing unless you're clear about it, and also making sure you get feedback on how you're doing. And lots of research shows the value of mastery. And in fact, as you would expect, it's quite stressful if you don't know what it is that you're meant to be doing. And, you know, of course, dissatisfying. It also inhibits your learning. How can you learn if you don't really know what it is you're meant to be doing and you don't get any feedback on how you're doing it? So again, we have a few challenges when we're working at home from the perspective of mastery. And one is that it is a bit harder sometimes for people to understand what's expected, particularly I think around things like, you know, what are we expecting in terms of hours? Do we expect everyone to be available at particular times, or is it fine for people actually to, you know, work whatever hours they like? So having some discussions around, you know, what are the norms for if someone's got challenges with childcare, what are the norms for the team and so on. I think also because we're simply seeing less of each other, there's less opportunity for giving feedback. I think one of the things too that can happen is that we get very focused on sort of the immediate issues and forgetting to take that big picture perspective. And so I've had to really remind myself to share with the team, you know, not to lose sight of the fact that, you know, when we come out of this, we've still got lots of big things that we're trying to do. We've still got competitors we've got to think about. So I think making sure people still are reminded about the bigger picture and how their work fits into that bigger picture is something that it's easy to lose sight of right now. And so, for example, again, here we see some findings from our initial survey around getting feedback and having clear objectives. And you can see that there are around about probably 55%, just over half the sample that are feeling quite clear about what they're doing and getting good feedback. But there's a fair chunk of people who are not feeling that. So we as individuals and leaders need to be thinking about how we can increase mastery at home. I think if you're an individual, it's incumbent upon you to ask if you're not clear. And I say that all the time to my team members. Look, I can't keep track of where you're all at. So tell me if you're not clear, let me know, and then we can act on it. And if you're feeling you're not getting feedback, ask for feedback. There's absolutely nothing wrong with saying, I'm feeling, you know, a bit unsure how I'm doing, you know, can you give me some feedback? In fact, as managers, we welcome that sort of opportunity. Of course, as leaders, being clear, clarifying what are the expectations, having a discussion around any new norms that might need to be established. And thinking about giving people feedback is important. And again, I have a blog there about setting your team up for success during the crisis, which focuses on these points. So I'm going to stop there because I've been talking a long time. I don't even know if anyone's still listening to me. So I think Maria...
Yes, you still have over 154 people online, so that's...
Fantastic.
Couple of things. One of the things that seems to be coming up time and time again, there is a lot of background noise, and it's coming from you. Do you have birds in the background?
Yes, I do. And because I'm working in the garden, and normally they're okay, but right at this moment they've gone crazy, but I think they've now stopped. So I'm sorry about that. It might be a bit tricky to go inside at this point. I'm thinking they've stopped, Maria, but if they do, what I'll do is I'll just pick up my computer and move inside.
Yeah, no problem. No
sorry
problem.
about that.
That's
yeah,
okay.
Normally this time of the day they're fine.
Okay,
So.
no problem. Most of the concerns have been raised about the background noise.
Oh, sorry. Oh,
the
gosh.
other thing around the video, I noticed the video wasn't working during the presentation, so we can certainly send the link out after after the presentation.
Okay.
Other than that, can't see any other questions.
Okay.
Pause for a minute.
Yeah, so I apologise everyone about the bird noise. Yes, they're a bit unpredictable and normally they're fine, but I will go inside if it continues. So
well, some people are actually enjoying the bird noises.
Okay.
Others aren't. So I guess it's that
Yeah. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about agency, and this is the importance of autonomy. And I think particularly in the field of research, many of us are very passionate about the importance of autonomy. It's often why we choose that career. It's often why we put up with lower salaries and all sorts of other things, because we value so strongly having some control and influence over the decisions in our work. And you can see there a picture of an academic who basically saying, I've had enough of this university. This is not my current university, just want to point out, you know, who's basically experienced a big centralisation program that has led that academic to say, I've had enough, I want to go somewhere where I'll have some more autonomy. It's not unique to academics though. In fact, autonomy, having agency in our work, is one of the most important drivers of things like stress. Low autonomy is very stressful, but also engagement, ownership over your work. And you can see that little picture there of a person that's lacking some ownership over their work, and so on and so forth. And of course, autonomy and agency is also really critical from an organisational perspective, especially for agility and innovation. And I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but I've noticed that during this pandemic, actually a lot of bureaucracy has been removed in order for us to do things more quickly and with more agility. And that's typical, right? Usually when things are very constrained, it's very hard to be agile and hard to be innovative. I've also put there that a lack of agency will mean a failure to get the benefits of working from home. So there is already some research on working from home. Is it more productive or less productive than working from work? And actually the research shows that for the smallish number of people that usually work from home, usually they are actually more productive and more engaged in their work. There seems to be a little bit of a ceiling effect if it's too much. So usually a couple of days is sufficient per week. Obviously now most people are working much more than that, so that makes the current situation a bit different. But one of the reasons that working from home is more productive for those people that have traditionally worked from home is because people have more autonomy over their hours of work, so they can sort of pace themselves a little bit. And that's actually what explains those benefits in productivity. And there's quite a bit of research that's shown that. So what are the challenges then of working from home from an agency perspective? Well, the first is that, you know, we do at the moment, many people have got some more autonomy, but it can also make it difficult for people to either get going or to stop working. And I'm not sure which category you're in, but from the research that we've done so far, it seems that people are usually in one category or the other. So in a sense, this is really about, we've got autonomy, many of us have got more autonomy than usual. So how do we really then work effectively within that autonomy? And from an individual perspective, a lot of it is about creating some structure some boundaries between your home and work. And that's been particularly important now because of the, you know, the sort of children being home and the speed at which we've had to get set up for working from home. All those things mean that it's been difficult to set up properly and to create those boundaries that we need. So in the blog, To Dress or Not to Dress, I talk about the importance of getting dressed and not working in your pajamas all day. And really that's just sort of a metaphor for this idea that what we need to do sometimes is really activate our worker identity, because we've got lots of different identities. And when we're at home, it's very easy for all those other identities to become more prominent. You know, your identity as a mother or a father, or, you know, as someone who needs to clean the house or whatever. So creating separate space and even getting dressed can create, it can activate that I'm working now mindset and enable you to better structure your day and create those boundaries. I've also just got a blog coming out this week around structuring your day things, simple things, and these are good strategies for time management anyway, irrespective of whether you're working at home, but the importance of having a daily plan, working in chunks. So working in, for example, it varies by people, but some people will suggest a 25-minute chunk and then you have a few minutes break. And that's really to rest your brain, because you can't concentrate for, you know, usually more than about 40 minutes or so. So, and of course the importance of breaks is really critical. Even what we call micro breaks, which are these just very short breaks. And of course, if you're one of those people who's working too much, I think it's also about, you know, getting out of your work clothes at the end of the day and swapping gear and doing some other things. And actually another one of the blogs that I've written is about recovery and the importance of detaching from work in the evening. Another challenge though that many people are experiencing that relates to autonomy is that some managers are finding that this working, managing people without a line of sight is very challenging. And actually here you can see some results from our survey where we asked people, were you monitored too much? And is your supervisor keeping close tabs on you by frequent checking? And you can see that about 1/3 of people are reporting being monitored too much and their manager just checking them all the time. And I think that's because some managers don't know how else to encourage people to work, and they're worried about people, you know, getting distracted and so on. And then also actually if we look at the managers in the sample, and there's at least 300 or so managers in our sample, and we ask them, you know, are you confident in your employees' capabilities to do their work? And at least 1/3 are reporting a lack of confidence that their employees can do the job. So you can see that this is a bit of a recipe for micromanagement and not really trusting employees to do the work. And again, I think lots of things that we need to think about there. Just highlight one, and that's what we need to move towards is focusing more on the outputs or the results of the work that people do and trying to manage those rather than focusing on the inputs. So rather than expecting someone necessarily to be sitting at their desk all day and managing and focusing on that, are they at their desk, are they at their desk? We should be focusing on, are they delivering what it is that they were meant to deliver? The Tethered or Trusted blog there, you know, I talk about, and several people have shared with me how what happens is the managers sort of call them or try to contact them, and they might literally be getting a coffee for 30 seconds, but that then leads the manager to think they're not there and start to go down this path of micromanaging and so on. And that means people are feeling really tethered actually to their desk, and like they can't even get up and have a coffee, which they normally would do, because they have to be available at all times and show that they really are working. So you can see that that sort of creates a recipe for distress. And just in terms of another feature, we just finished a study of Chinese workers during the lockdown, and we did that earlier than our current study, so we're a bit further advanced. And we showed that leader support actually was the best predictor of procrastination. In other words, if leaders were supportive, their workers were less likely to procrastinate and get distracted and so on. So I think actually, rather than micromanaging people, we should be looking at their results and supporting them to perform effectively. So moving on to relational. Relational is recognizing that we as human beings have a fundamental need to connect with other people. And that's absolutely a vital element that defines us as human. And I'll just go straight down into some of the challenges. They're pretty obvious here. There's been a lot of talk about social isolation, loneliness. There's also a risk of professional isolation. Actually, research shows that people who are teleworkers often either fear being left out because they're isolated, or they actually are left out because they're not visible, they're not talking around the water cooler, so they don't get those sort of more informal professional development opportunities that they might normally get. So I think those are some of the challenges that we face at home. And of course, the whole virtual teams and coordinating and so on is a challenge. I think from an individual perspective, one of the things we need to do is just be more conscious about connecting with people. When we normally go into the office, we sort of are going to bump into people and we're going to talk with people, we're going to connect with people anyway without having to orchestrate it at all. But now we have to be more proactive, I think, about reaching out and connecting with people if we are feeling isolated. In the blog that I show there, I talk about not just connecting with people, but building high quality connections. And I give some tips around going beyond just reaching out to people, but how to build a really strong, mutually beneficial relationship with people. And of course, as a leader, we need to be providing that emotional support for people at this time and the practical support. And this means probably some more one-on-ones. I'm doing a lot more one-on-ones with all of the people I manage. They're short though, I keep them up to 15 minutes sometimes. And just checking in on how people are doing. And also, I think the other thing that's important is to be thinking about what sort of interesting development opportunities there might be for people, because that's actually a way again for people to connect. So are there two members of your team that could teach each other something, for example? We're also in our workplace, and I'm sure many of you are doing this, setting up, we have things like virtual morning teas and sort of strategies to try and replace those informal conversations that we normally have around the water cooler. And finally, I just want to go to T, which stands for tolerable. And this is about having demands in the workplace that are manageable and tolerable. Just to say, we all have demands in the work, whatever it is that we do. It might be emotional demands, it might be time pressure demands, it might be intellectual demands because the work's really, really hard. We all have demands in work, and that's of course because we've got goals we've got to deliver. But those demands should feel tolerable and they should feel manageable. And again, without going into too much detail, there's a lot of suicide in the workplace or as a result of work, way more than shark attacks there. And that's really just to try to highlight the negative effects of intolerable demands on things like burnouts and even things like cardiovascular disease. And from an organisational perspective, things like compensation claims, the fastest growing area of workers' compensation claims right now is mental health. And that in turn, the biggest category within that, it's to do with pressures of work. And we are seeing some of these demands right now. And obviously some of them are to do with kids maybe not being at school, but also the general uncertainty of the situation. And also, as I've already mentioned, people feeling this pressure to be present, to be available and working at all times, and so on and so forth. So Again, some guidance there from a personal perspective, showing self-compassion, being kind to yourself, not having unrealistic expectations, having breaks, engaging in recovery, and some more tips there if those are challenges for you. And again, coming back to the importance of the leader for observing how people are doing, whether they're seeming to be okay or struggling, and providing them with the support and the autonomy that they need to be able to manage those demands. So if you've got this smart work design, and that applies just as well at home as it does in the workplace, it's going to prevent mental ill health, it's going to make people more motivated, and they're going to perform better as a consequence. And of course, it also facilitates learning and growth. And I just want to end by sharing some statistics, and I did these late last night, so I'm going to be very clear that these are preliminary. But if we look, we measured, we used this psychological distress measure called the K5 in our research. And this data I've put here shows that about 13% of the non-Indigenous Australian population has high or very high levels of psychological distress normally, in normal times. And you can see here that 27% of Indigenous people have high or very high levels of distress, and that's what this piece of research was showing. But last night I used this measure to calculate the level of distress for the 1,300 or 1,400 people we have in our sample, and identified that 34.5% of the sample have high or very high levels of distress. So to me, what this says is we really need to give this issue more attention than ever. It was an issue before, but distress and mental health is an issue more than ever. And I just also did some super quick correlations, and many of you are researchers, so you understand correlations are not causality, but I do just want to show you that some of the stronger correlations which sort of surprised me. So what you see here is that people with high task variety have less distress. That's what we'd predict. But a big correlation there with having sufficient work. So people who feel they don't have enough work to do have reporting lower levels of, higher levels of distress. And that's quite a big number. You can see the feedback stats. I won't go through them all. Again, this monitoring comes up. So if people feel they've got trust from their supervisor, they're less distressed. And if there is no monitoring, close monitoring, I showed you some of that data before, then there is less distress. A big number there. Social support, again, this is sort of what we normally see in research. If you've got support, you get less distress. But what you can also see over here, what shocked me actually was technology hassles has a very high correlation with psychological distress. And I can understand why. We had some technology hassles just before we started this presentation, and it was very stressful, but it was only a few minutes, and if you're having them a lot, it's probably worth. And look at job insecurity there. People who are worrying about their job, extremely strongly correlated with psychological distress. So those are preliminary results. They are only correlations, but to me, they straight away suggest some of the things that we need to be focusing on. And last but not least, this is a word cloud. I asked people for tips on, in the survey, we asked people for tips on being effective during this time. And you can see just from that word cloud, breaks and routine and morning and exercise all sort of popping up there as very common tips that people share. So we are doing this research. It is continuing. You're more than welcome to join if you haven't already. And if you have, thank you so much. Your contribution is so valuable, and I hope you can already see just from those super quick results that I've shared how valuable it is. And just also, I've been mentioning the videos and blogs. They are there on the website because obviously in this amount of time, we can't sort of go into all of those topics in detail. So I just want to end now by thanking you and welcoming some questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sharon. That was most informative. The questions that we have, I'll take you through those if you like.
Yep.
Kim asks, can you give us some more ideas about how to reframe our thinking about work?
Okay, that's good. Yeah, and I guess, you know, every job is different, and to some extent it's, you know, it's really rethinking what the purpose of your job is, and bringing that more centrally in mind, or also slightly reconfiguring that purpose. So to give another example, you know, you might see yourself as you might be a cook, you know, but you might see yourself more as a sort of food artist, or, you know, let me give a real example, you know, from, you know, I go to a wonderful hairdresser, and she doesn't see her job actually just as being a hairdresser. She sees her job as being a hairdresser, but she actually, when you talk with her in more depth, she sees herself as someone who makes lives better, because she talks a lot to people all day. And for some people, she might be the only person they talk to all day. So that's a sort of crafting how you think about your work. I'm not just a hairdresser, I'm actually someone who makes people's lives better. So that's what I mean by that. So I hope that answers the question, Kim.
Fantastic, thank you. Miranda asks, I'm going to hopefully be employing someone to work with me to balance my COVID-19 surplus workload. Do you have any suggestions for bringing someone into a work relationship remotely?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question, because I mean, one of the great things about the situation now is that most of us have got these relationships with people already, and now we're just working at home. So it's challenging enough under that circumstance, right? We know the people that we're working with, and it's much more difficult, of course, if you're bringing someone in from the beginning. So I think my main suggestion would be just making sure that that person gets the opportunity to connect with people regularly. And, you know, so you get the opportunity to share with them expectations of how you work as a team, what the norms are. So getting them into as many meetings and socializing as you can, without exhausting them, of course, because all these Zoom meetings get exhausting. But I think that sort of, you have to, in a sense, accelerate the connection in a way that you might normally not have to think so much about, because they'd just be there in the workplace. So I would say you talking to them regularly, but also ask them to do one-on-ones with each team member and just interview them about who they are and how they got to be there, and just build those connections, I think would be a starting point.
Next question might relate to what you've just touched upon. In fact, the person says, regarding the isolation, I think professional isolation may not be so detrimental for minorities. They are often invisible or overlooked physical environments. So your suggested actions could really level the playing field for some.
Oh, that's a really nice comment. And, you know, actually, I did a blog the other day also around Zoom meetings, because they do get very tiring, and trying to understand why. And actually in that blog I talk about how the research shows that particularly mediums like online discussions, where people put their ideas in, and even like this chat down the side here, they actually engender more equality, because the effect of power and status is mitigated a bit. So, because normally you might feel too shy or too different to raise your hand and put a question like that up, but you can here, right? So we can also use some of these this virtual environment actually to make things a bit more equal. So I think that's a really important comment.
Fantastic. I think they were all the questions that we have, Sharon. I'm not sure if there are any others. Oops, here we go. One final one. Any tip for a genuine performance management situation during isolation?
Yeah, that's a difficult one, because, you know, of course, virtual communication, even though Zoom and Skype and things that we've got right now, you know, are way better than email. They're still very impaired forms of communication. You know, you can't see somebody's whole body. You don't know the environment that they're in. You can't necessarily maintain good eye contact. So it's extremely challenging to do things like performance management, even with Zoom and Teams and these sorts of wonderful programs. So look, I think you just need to approach it in the way that you would normally approach it, you know, so really good preparation, being really clear what it is that you're going to, you know, going to address, you know, making sure you've got the concrete factual examples of the issues you want to raise. I think all those things still apply. But I would recommend the richer medium you can do it in, the better. And by rich, I mean, obviously face-to-face is the richest. So if you were able to do it face-to-face, that would be preferable. But second would be these sorts of forums like Zoom. And then, but definitely do not do it, obviously, by email or that sort of medium, because it's too much open to misinterpretation and all that sort of stuff.
Fantastic. I think that's probably all we've got time for. Thank you very much, Sharon, for your time. That was such an informative presentation. For all our members, this information will be up on our website shortly, will be circulated to you. I also like to remind our members that we have 2 other upcoming PD at Zoom series sessions. One this Thursday entitled The Upside of COVID-19, Flipping Our Mindsets Away from Crisis to Challenges to Adaptation and Opportunity. And that's been presented by Andy Lamb and facilitated by Ash Roberts and Tara McLaren. We also have another session on the 5th of May, which is on future research management leaders. And that will comprise of a panel of current leaders, Z Upton, Campbell Thompson, Maxine Bryant, Alistair Duncan. And that session will be facilitated by Steve Fahanan. So look out for that one and register for that one as well. Thank you once again, Sharon. And
thanks, Maria. Can I just ask people not to tweet, for example, that statistic about the mental health? It's only preliminary research, so just don't quite want it on the news just yet. Thank you. But thank you so much for inviting me, and I apologise again about the birds. As you can see, they've quietened down now.
They have.
And thank you. I can see some nice comments there. Thank you very much. Appreciated. And we'll make sure that we share their links to those resources with you.
We will.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.